Well, welcome everybody to another edition of the Psych Monologues. I am Dr. Ray Mitch, your host. You're listening into a podcast that is committed to looking at three major areas of our lives: our faith, our psychology, and that may be one area that you may or may not have spent a whole lot of time thinking about, and just spiritual formation. What does the journey with Jesus look like, if you will? And everybody's in a different place, and that's kind of what a podcast like this is for. So the Psych Monologues was actually the beginning of all of this. Started back in March of 2020. It was a response to the pandemic as a means of staying in touch for me with the seniors in a grief and loss class, and out of it was born the Psych Monologues and what you have today. Eventually, over time, one of the things that I've talked about a lot during my time of teaching at CCU has been the something that I call the stained glass self. And so I was prompted, goaded, tempted into putting together a nonprofit organization that would be committed to helping people overcome and become people that could be seen. I mean, you might want to call it pure glass people. But my observations from talking to people for as long as I have has been that we tend to live behind a stained glass. And the stained glass, if you know anything about one of those, what you see is an image that the artist wanted to create for you to see. It might be a scene out of Jesus's life, for example, if you've seen one in a church. But stained glass comes in a lot of different forms and shapes and sizes and so forth. The one thing to keep in mind is it gives you an image to interact with, not what is behind the image. And oftentimes, in our case, we create a stained glass that looks like we want to be known rather than the way that we believe we would be known if somebody were to see us through pure glass. So the organization was called Stained Glass International, SGI for short, and the mission was to equip, encourage, and empower the next generation of Christians to live authentically in relationship to Jesus, with themselves and other people. And themselves is one of them. And this is not self-absorption or taking time to just be the source of truth in ourselves. No, that's not it at all. Of course, the minute Jesus enters the picture, then because he is God, then myself comes into view. And I need to see it in terms of my relationship to Jesus. And certainly as an outgrowth of that, it has a direct impact on how I relate to other people. So what I'm trying to see happen and what I'm trying to be the catalyst for is what I call outposts for the heart. Safe gathering places where people can come and they can belong before they ever believe. They don't have to believe in Jesus, but they have to be willing to want to spend some time talking about life as it really is, not as it should be. And so there's no effort here to ask people to talk about something that isn't true. And everybody enters, even a group of people, with presentation, if you will. We present ourselves in particular ways. So what Stained Glass International is attempting to do is to build what I call outposts for the heart and communities for the soul. An outpost, as the name implies, it is a safe place to go in the midst of a battlefield and in the midst of hostile territory. And I believe increasingly we are in one of those times. So come on in. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, relax. If you're driving, keep your hands on the wheel. But I want to talk about the things that matter to you. And I think I have one issue that I think is worth our while. Now, just to bring you up to speed a little bit about where we came from, I have been embarking on a kind of three different series. One is Broken People of the Bible, which we just finished up we did one last week. And what we're doing is we're just taking the certain broken people that Jesus has interactions with in Scripture, in the Gospel of Mark. And I picked that one because it's the shortest one, and you can read through it in a couple of hours probably. That might be generous, but anyway. And so we've got that. And then I also have another one going that I just started on, and that is, the spiritual journey and what does it look like. And then the last one I was looking at, and it was way back 3 weeks ago or so, was what are barriers to God? And actually what we're going to talk about tonight is related to that in a lot of ways. But the barrier to God that I looked at was being angry at God. And we took some time to unpack that and look at that at some length. I certainly hope so. So what's tonight? Have I built it up enough? Tonight is a free form. We're heading into Easter week, and we're and Palm Sunday. Even though there's a lot of Christians, I think, that are in non-denominational churches that are not necessarily emphasizing the Christian calendar, okay? There are plenty of churches I know that emphasize Ash Wednesday, which is the beginning of Lent, and we're now at Palm Sunday, and the end of Lent, of course, is the end of the week of Holy Week or Easter week, this week coming up. And so there's a varying levels of emphasis on that. But there's one topic in particular that's just been pressing in on me, and I thought this would be a perfect time to talk about it in light of it being Easter week. I mean, if there's any time people show up at church, it's Christmas and Easter, right? And Easter's coming. And whether or not they only give kind of salutary a wave at Jesus and Easter and all that it means, or eggs and the Easter bunny or whatever else, there's still something that comes up that I think is worth paying attention to. And sometimes some of the traditions and things like that we've brought up have actually been in response to this very issue. And the issue is this, is that if I ask you, what is your image of God, what would you say it is? And whatever comes to your mind is probably an indication of what your image of God is, okay? And so hang on to that while I'm talking. I have two different quotes that I want to kind of launch from, and then we'll go into this more. The first one is this. It comes from a theologian and a pastor by the name of A.W. Tozer, and he makes this comment. He says, what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us. Not about God, but about us. It says something about us. So whatever came to your mind when I asked, what's your image of God, has a direct impact on probably how you relate to people, probably how you relate even to your family, because we tend to talk about in family terms in the church and in Christianity, and probably how you relate to yourself. Now you can say, well, wait a minute. What does myself have to do with God? Well, to varying degrees, remember something. we react to something. We're not prone to react to nothing, right? I mean, why? There's nothing there. So our tendency is either to move toward it, to move against it, or to move away from it. It's one of those three things that we tend to do. And we do that with God. So when Tozer says what comes into our minds when we think about God is the most important thing about us, probably betrays something about how we relate in general, and God is just the specific deity, if you will, or the being that we react to, and our reactions tell something about us. Every counselor knows that. Can't get away from it. So the second quote is this, and this one's mildly humorous. But Blaise Pascal was a mathematician, a scientist. He was also a philosopher And he said this, he said, God made man in his own image, and man returned the favor. And Voltaire said, man reciprocated more than enough. And so we have these two things. One is whatever comes to my mind when I think about God says something about me, and I have a propensity for making God into a God of my own making, not the God that's pictured in Jesus in the Bible or pictured or represented by Christians, which is probably even worse. So, what do our thoughts say about us? And one of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking about this is let me put it another way. I have a class, and they know who they are. And I have a class that I was talking about this very thing about the image of God, and we were talking at length. And I said, so what image of God comes to your mind when we think about the image of God? And first of all, right off the bat, there was not much of anything. It was like, I don't have an image of God. I mean, how do you capture? And usually what a lot of people, a lot of Christians will do is, how do you capture an image of an infinite, sovereign, all-powerful, all-knowing God? But we do. I think we do. And one of the things that I point out a lot to people about this very topic is that, particularly with kids, and this is usually where we learn it, right, is when we're growing up. And if we're in even a nominal Christian home, we probably will have said grace, which is, I wouldn't say a Christian word, but it's partly that. But we shape an image. And so even if we're doing our prayers at night and we're saying something like, or a little kid will mimic their parents, and they'll say, "Dear Heavenly Father," in their nightly prayer, the question is who are they addressing? Because they don't have a very good developed image of God, right? I mean, they're not old enough to do that. So who are they addressing? And I would say that my conclusion, some of the things I've seen with kids, is that what they're actually saying is they're saying, "Dear heavenly version of my earthly father." Now, suddenly the topic gets really pretty scary, because everybody's had, as far as I can tell, everybody has a dad, and for good or for ill, and everybody has different experiences along those same lines. And dads, and I'm not excluding moms when I'm saying this, okay? But dads have a unique place to play, and partly it's because of this connection to God. Now, that doesn't make them a deity. It doesn't make them all-powerful and all-knowing, nothing like that. But in a kid's mind, adults are pretty powerful people, and they're like a God in some respects. And so, how do we decide how to react to God? If we come into a relationship with Jesus and into Christianity, we bring with us all of these same concepts. And so in a lot of ways, people will have a clear sense of who God is by how the parents were. Now, this is where moms come in. Moms and dads actually end up providing a composite for what an authority figure looks like. And that authority figure, particularly when a child comes into contact with talking about God and Jesus and everything else, that authority figure gets laid on to that person. And depending on what they observe as they're growing up with their parents, both parents now, depending on what they observe, they might come to the conclusion, for example, that his favorite hobby is being mad at me. I never seem to get anything right. One of the things I see when I hear people talk a lot about, "I'll just never be enough," that one phrase, "never enough," is often connected to God. It's like no matter what I do, it's never enough. He's never satisfied. He always is busting my chops because I'm sinful and broken and blah, blah, blah. And it's like his favorite hobby is being mad at me. Or, so there's that one, okay? And again, I'm trying to prime the pump here as far as your thoughts about your image of God. Or there's also the God that has that's a celestial cop, and he's paying attention and waiting for every infraction that I do, and he catches me doing it and quote unquote holds me accountable, and I pay the price. And he's trying to figure out what punishment is the best one to correct whatever I've done wrong. Now let me stop there for a second. Interestingly enough, the God we have created, think about Blaise Pascal earlier, the thing we have created, the God we have created is a God of our own making. He is not powerful enough to save us when we need him the most. He just isn't. Not the God we make. Okay, now, you literalists out there, don't get all twisted because I'm saying God isn't powerful enough. The God we make is not powerful enough. And oftentimes the God we worship is the God we have made, not the God that is pictured in Scripture and in Jesus, because he is the human face of God. So most of us conclude that the best way to respond to an angry or an accountant God, there's always the bookkeeper, right? Who's paying attention to all the little details and all the things I do wrong and all that I should have said and all that I could have done and all of the these sort of things. I better take a drink here. That kind of God, what we come to conclude is that the best way to deal with those kinds of gods, all right, and these are all human-made, is to earn his acceptance in some way. Earn his acceptance in some way. So if I behave rightly, and I've talked about this too, but if I behave rightly, then he will accept me and he won't have as much to hold against me and provide punishment for. So I can allay my punishment. I can delay my punishment. So our image of God says everything about me, about us, because our image of God betrays the kind of God that we tend to worship, that we interact with, that we say we're having a relationship with. So let me ask a different question that helps kind of continue to develop this. Is what do you think God feels when he thinks of you? What do you think he feels? And I'll let it settle in on you for a second, because I think in a lot of cases, and I've read these responses because I have asked this question to students going through one of my classes. And what I read is he feels disappointment, he feels anger. He doesn't feel anything at all because I'm really not that significant enough for him to get upset about. Or he's just not there anyway, so who cares, right? We don't think about the fact that God could even remotely be sensitive and tender to our human condition enough to not feel those things. And so essentially, because of these emotions that we attribute to God, and I'll give you another example. Clearly there are lots and lots of examples in the Old Testament, for example, of that God is wrathful. I think most people would say that God of the Old Testament is wrathful, is angry a lot, and he's busting people all the time, and he has snakes crawling all over him and boils breaking out and all of these things. And probably the most signature person would be Job. And quite honestly, between you, me, and the hedge post fence, Job is one of my favorite books, partly because of just how human Job is. But I think what's unique about Job is what God said about him at the very beginning of the book. And he sang his praises. He said, God was saying Job was a righteous man. Not Job was saying he was a righteous man. That would make him self-righteous. But God was saying this, and essentially, he's a friend of mine. Go check it out. Talking to Satan, our adversary, the accuser. So we see God as an Old Testament God who's angry and punishing, and when I don't perform up to the standards I should, he's disappointed. He's a God of justice, and all of, at some level, all of those are true. That it's not wrong, and we can't cast it any other way than what's portrayed in the Old Testament. It's not. It's there, right? Except Jesus. Because something dramatically happened by the time Jesus hit the scene and started into ministry, and he said, all that you've learned up until now, which would include the Old Testament and Moses and all that law, you've heard it said, but I tell you, it's about your heart. It's about how you think. It's how you frame the world, how you understand life. It's about those things that need to be addressed, need to be thought through. So what we come to conclude, just to put all these things together, is what we come to conclude is that I actually have an impact on God's love for me. And in putting it in just bald terms, we actually think God can be controlled. Now, you ask somebody straight up, any Christian, you ask them, can God be controlled? And they'll say, no, of course not. He's all powerful. They'll go into their little routine, their belief routine, if you will. But you go off and watch them deal with their deepest, darkest emotions and their deepest, darkest flaws, the things that they hide and don't let anybody see. They see God as thoroughly disappointed and angry and upset and ready to punish them. As a matter of fact, we get to some point oftentimes in our lives where we get to start saying, I'm beyond help anymore. God doesn't love me anymore. I've completely walked away from him. He just doesn't care. Funny thing, I would imagine those thoughts went through the prodigal son's head too. So if I can make God angry or sad or happy by how I choose to act, then if I act differently, then he'll be happy and he will say to me finally, well done, my good and faithful servant. Now, there are some people out there that I'm talking to that I know have had the kind of conversation, or not the kind of interactions with church people, Christians, that they say, I don't give a flying you-know-what about it. I don't, because maybe I lived that way, or those people reflected Jesus in that way, which, by the way, is a perverse version of Jesus. And I don't want any. It hurt too bad. I threw myself into it. I was all in, and I could never do enough. See, there's that word again. So we would never think or say out loud that we can control God, but in terms of how we relate to God, we are implying that if I, then God, if I do the right thing, if I say all the right things, if I go to church the right number of times. I have a quiet time every day. I pray every day and all of those sorts of things. If I do all that, then God will be happy and he will be pleased with me. And the crazy thing about it is God's love has nothing to do with you or me. It has nothing to do with you or me. It has everything to do with who he is. And this is the jacked up version of God that people oftentimes walk around with. And it never gets questioned. It never gets examined even. And so let me proceed down this path a little bit farther, okay? One of the things that I think most of us hate the most is being misunderstood. I think there's very few things that I've seen in the course of time talking to people over the years that is more disturbing and triggers so much action on people's part is being misunderstood. As a matter of fact, they will withhold certain behavior. They will say certain things to make sure that somebody understands where they're coming from. Now, there's no guarantee of that. There isn't. But we do everything in our power to be seen and understood as we would have it to be. Why? And quite honestly, the why is I don't trust people. And what do I don't trust them about? I don't trust them to make the right conclusions about me that I don't even agree with. I don't even believe. But if I could get other people to believe it, then maybe I could come around and believe it too, which is a lie. Because we have ongoing 24/7, 365, what do I want to say? Indoctrination going on in our heads the entire time. And it's always running back there. All that happens is when we blow it or something doesn't work out quite right, it just bursts onto the scene. And it's like this serpent head comes up and says, see, I told you. I told you. There's evidence again. You are just a screw up and you'll always be one. But see, we have created a God that we worship rather than worshiping the God that created us. Now, let me say that again. We have created a God to worship who is containable and who is manipulatable and controllable and everything else within our power. So we have created a God that we worship rather than worshiping the God that created us and loves us beyond measure, which is exactly what blows an internal brain circuit in us because I can't wrap my head around that. So because I can't wrap my head around it, what do? I anchor it to something. And I anchor it to the nearest person or thing or relationship or whatever else. I mean, we'll look for an idol. We will. It's in the human DNA, spiritual DNA, to look for an idol. But what kind of idol or God do we worship? And then we wonder when we get deep in the weeds and underground or underwater and we're crying out to God, what God is it that we're crying out to? The one we've created or the one that created us? And it's hard. It is really, really hard to get at this. Oftentimes it takes going through some really difficult times where we've come face to face with a true picture of who God is, a true picture of who he is. And like I said, it is contained in the person of Jesus. That's what we were told. We were told he is the exact duplicate, representative, carbon copy, the radiance of God himself. That's who Jesus is. Okay, so settle in on that one. So if I understand in all the ways that I can Jesus as represented in the Gospels, then that's God. And he came so that he could be known. Why? Because we long to be known just like he longs to be known. And we long to be known because we are created in his image. Go figure. So what do we do, right? I mean, what kind of image? Let me put it this way. I can hang on to the image of the God that I've created. I can. And I can get along. I can actually get pretty far with that created God, if you will. But at some level, I know it's not going to be good enough at some level. Why? Because I'm not good enough. So whatever I create is not going to be good enough either, right? So why, if we worship the God as portrayed by Jesus to us, which is God, all right? It's not like he's a carbon copy or something like that. He is God, and God clothed himself in human flesh so that he could be known by us in the dimension in which we exist and in our flesh. Then we have to grapple with the question, why does he love me at all? And I'll go back to what I said before. God's love has everything to do with what is true about him. It has nothing to do with me. Now, that doesn't mean I'm insignificant. It doesn't, because if I were so insignificant, Jesus wouldn't have spent his life on earth dying so that, here comes Easter, so that I could actually have a relationship with God. So I don't have to have, I don't have to have a clearly formed image of God. I have to figure out who this being is that I am relating to and the nature of who he is, and do my best, as hard as it is, me being stuck in these three dimensions, trying to interact with a being that is outside of all of those dimensions and beyond my imagination, and yet accessible to my imagination. And those things are the very things of the image of God. Is God good? And in a lot of cases, people that have run aground because of a bad representation of Jesus in the church and Christians and all of that, they'd say, no, he's not. And there usually is a specific reason why they say that. And sometimes it's because he didn't come through when they expected him to. Now, again, let me be delicate about this, but again, God is not a trained seal. He's not a celestial vending machine, and I do all the right things, press the button, and out comes a miracle. It doesn't work that way. The issue is, what is the nature of the relationship I have? And that's the issue, because the relationship enriches me, changes me. We can even use the word transforms me. It brings me from one place to another, from one substance to another substance. I don't get it either entirely. We can't wrap our heads around that stuff. There are some things that are just left to mystery. But if I don't trust God, then I don't want any mystery. I would rather create a God of certainty, a God I can know and I can control by acting the right way, saying the right things, and doing all the right things. Or I can worship the God that knows me and is unknowable and yet knowable. He invites me into relationship. This thing that I call the image of God is contaminated, that I have. This image of God is contaminated by all the authority figures that have marched their way through my life. And I have to find a way to participate in the transformation of not only my image of God, but what my relationship to him is. And I go into talking about this, and sometimes I feel like I'm making the water only muddier. But yeah, it is, because it's about relationship and trust. And so there are not things that I'm going to entirely know, but I do know one thing. And that is that my Abba loves me, period. As I am, not as I should be, because I'm never going to be what I should be, but he loves me as I am. And you know what? If I can figure out how to embrace that, then it actually frees me to become much more than I am. Makes sense? And that's what's such a crazy thing about this is, you know as well as I do that you get into a relationship with somebody and you get close with that person and you tend to become more like that person, whether you like it or not. We as humans have these things called mirror neurons. And the greatest place to watch mirror neurons is in church. I don't know if you may not go to church, but that's fine. You go to a concert, you can go to anywhere, and if the band is moving, the people are moving. I mean, in church, and I watch this all the time, and I just kind of smile and chuckle because, there are people up on the stage that are leading the worship and whatnot, and they may be swaying, and the people in front of me are swaying, and there's a part of me that just wants to stay stock still just to break the mirror neurons that are firing in me. But we're prone to imitation because imitation is the beginning of learning. And then when I begin to bring in what I'm imitating, which is oftentimes in the context of a relationship, my life and my heart begins to align with that person that I'm in relationship with. And so it might sound foreign to people to hear somebody like me say, my Abba loves me. Abba is a foreign word for us. It would be even crazier for somebody to say, my daddy loves me. There is no more emotionally charged word in our language than daddy. It really is. It strikes a chord in everybody I've ever seen. And when I remind people of that's the image Jesus gave his disciples about prayer, it's remarkable, for one, that the God of the universe would be characterized in such uniquely intimate terms. Abba was a word that could only be used by children of their parent. No, you couldn't call, if you came in as a friend in the house, you could not refer to that person as Abba. But only the kid could. Only the kid could. And kids have a unique relationship with their daddy, right? There's a story told in the White House when John F. Kennedy was president. And Carolyn, one of his little kids, and there were little kids in the White House at the time, and she had a friend with her, and so they were playing around, and now I think it's all separated because of the White House and the private residence and all that jazz. But at that point in time, and this is just a story, but she had a friend, and they went charging toward the Oval Office, and the friend pulled her back and said, "Wait, the president is in there." And she said, "Oh, it's okay. He's my dad." The God of the universe calls us into an Abba relationship. And that always strikes an emotional chord in people. It always does. And most of it is because that image has gotten so corrupted, so contaminated. and for a lot of good reasons. There were good reasons that it got contaminated because of how people behaved and selfishly and using people or whatever it was. And even good dads are still broken dads. They still are sinful. They still disappoint. They still do things that hurt their kids. But few kids will say, unless they've been thoroughly abandoned, and I understand those too, few kids will say, my dad loved me as best he could. This kind of dad loves me better than anyone. And that scares us, quite honestly. I think it scares us because that kind of love turns us to look at ourselves. And we start thinking in terms of deserving and what have I done and I don't deserve this and these sorts of things. And God, I'll go back to what I said before. God's love has everything to do with what is true about him and his love for us. It's not about me. The fact that he turns it to me is remarkable. And that's the image that we have to find a way to get reoriented, I think would be a better way to put it. Not changed, but certainly transformed. Now, where, right? Where can we do something like this if you want to do it? Oftentimes, church is the last place that you can get this done. I recognize that. As a matter of fact, for a lot of people, why would I want to go back to the very place that jacked it up in the first place? I get that. But I would go back to the very beginning of the podcast when I was talking about the mission of SGI. Because my vision of what an outpost could be would be the outpost could be that place to rework and reimagine and re-understand what the true image of the God who created me is, so that I can worship, I can be in relationship with that God, rather than create a God that I can control, contain, and demand certainty of. Because that God never evokes respect. It doesn't. Because it's not a God. It's not the God of the universe. Now, at the same time, I have to grapple with the level of trust I'm willing to have for that kind of God, the one that's all-powerful and all-loving and lavishly gracious and loving toward me. And I can't do that alone. I mean, there are so many times where in groups of people, which you can make a case is a community of people, in groups of people, I learn what the right image of God is, not my distorted one. And I'll end on this. I challenged a student of mine with bringing out a very painful story of his recent past. And he had done all the thinking for everybody that he might reveal that story to. And I said, if you're willing, you might want to try and find out and see if they actually will. I know it's risky. I understand it's risky. I get that. But you just might want to try it. Because my hunch is they will not act the way you think they will. And sure enough, they didn't. And in that moment in time, his image of God was shifted. Because people's reaction with love and grace and acceptance shifted his image of God because they reflected God in that moment. See, we're not going to figure this out on our own, because the battle that's going on in my head is a battle I'm always losing. I'm always fighting, but a lot of times I'm always losing. But when I draw that out and somebody looks and listens to that story and says, oh yeah, I know that battle. I've been on that battlefield for a while. Let me tell you how it went for me and what I found out. One, I have somebody just say, yeah, that's a legit battle. And two, I've had somebody say, that person is saying, I'll tell you what, since I know about that a little bit, let's fight it together. Let's try to reorient our understanding of who God is together, and we can reflect God to one another and shift this image of God together. And that's powerful stuff. That's the kind of stuff that Jesus was talking about when he said, when 2 or 3 people gather together in my name, I am there in their midst. It's not a matter of asking him to show up. He's there, which is crazy, which is completely crazy. So I think I'm going to end there. It's worth grappling with. I know it's not easy, but the hope would be that you could find 2 or 3 safe people to talk about what your image of God is, and then talk about or look even into the Gospels and say, who is this Jesus? Because there are time and time again, people in Scripture are just like us. They're curious. It's like, who is this guy? He hangs out with sinners, prostitutes, and tax collectors. And even though we don't have them around anymore these days, not necessarily, he hangs out with those people. And it's like, hey, I kind of like those kind of people. And if that's what God says he's coming to be a part of and hang out with and get to know them and provide them with a relationship and show them a different way, I think I might be interested in that kind of thing. So something to consider for the week leading up to Easter and all that it means for us. And I know that there are lots of people from different perspectives that are coming at this, and hopefully it will have triggered some thoughts for everybody. So if you have questions or reactions to some of what I've talked about today, please DM me. Let me know on Instagram. I'd love to hear your feedback. You can keep an eye on the website. A variety of things show up there, that new content and new blog posts and things like that will probably be more forthcoming as time goes along. As long as I'm in the teeth of the end of my semester, probably not a lot is going to be happening there. But once the summer hits, then probably a flurry of things will start happening on the website and also just with SGI. So the other thing you can find on the website is what I call digital devotionals. Every other day of the week, you can get a devotional about setting new boundaries, having healthy relationships. You can find out about that, and for a small donation, you can get it every other day of the week, and it will be an encouragement about setting them, about knowing about them, about maintaining good boundaries in relationships. You can get it all in that subscription to it, and it's a donation of $5 for a month, or semi-annual, which is 6 months, or an annual subscription to it, and that is a contribution to the overall mission and purpose of SGI. You can also follow us on any of the social media outlets like Instagram at the Psych Monologues, Facebook Ray.Mitch, and LinkedIn Dr. Mitch, MITSCH. So you can find us there, subscribe, follow us. That would be hugely helpful. If anything in these podcasts are helpful to you or interesting or encouraging to you, please be sure to leave a review or say something that might bring other people to paying attention to what I'm trying to do here with SGI and the Psych Monologues. We're found on any place you listen to podcasts. So whether that's Spotify or iTunes or Amazon Music or anything else, you'll find us there. And last but not least, not the least, is that if you're interested in partnering with us, just to help us continue to grow the scholarship fund for students and other people to attend a silent retreat, which is another way to learn how to shift our image of God, then we would be ever so grateful for your partnership in contributing to SGI. All of the gifts are tax deductible since the SGI has just been named a tax-exempt organization. So you can do that online on the front page at drmitch.com. At the very bottom, there's a Donate Now button, and you can donate to SGI. You can be a monthly donor. And that would be even more helpful because it takes money to keep these websites going and to produce resources and do the things that we are hoping to do into the future with SGI. So if you'd rather send a physical check, you certainly can do that as well. Just make it out to Stained Glass International and send it to the address SGI, P.O. Box 160, Eastlake, Colorado 80614. You can send it to us there as well. If you'd rather send us a physical check, you're more than welcome to do that as well. So thanks so much for listening to me. This topic is a really, really powerful one, and I just realized the farther in I got how much it impacts even my own journey that I sometimes will talk about. And so this image of God thing captured my attention, and I hope tonight has given you a little bit of some consideration or pause about your relationship with Jesus and what that looks like, and how do you engage your relationship with Him. So thanks so much for joining me. And as always, I'll be here waiting for you next week. It will be Easter weekend, so it will be on the backside of that, and we'll have plenty to talk about after that as well. But as always, love ya. Later. Bye.